The colony of New Dawn lay stretched across the wide plains of a distant world. From above, the settlement looked like a scattering of domes and metal structures placed against the endless horizon. The skies here were not gentle. Every few months, the atmosphere brewed storms of electric fire, violent enough to tear through steel roofs and melt equipment. The colonists feared these storms, for they came without warning and left behind destruction. On one such evening, the sky turned an unnatural shade of violet. Lightning forked across the horizon, lighting up the land like a battlefield. Plasma clouds rolled in, carrying winds strong enough to tear down walls. Alarms echoed across New Dawn, calling all colonists to their shelters. Inside his workshop, Elias worked quickly. He was a mechanic, a man more comfortable with tools than with people. His hands were stained with grease and his clothes bore countless tears from sharp metal edges. He was not afraid of storms, but he respected them. As the alarms blared, Elias checked his machines, locked the doors, and made sure the power cells were sealed. Another storm, he muttered to himself. Always when I have work left undone. The winds began to howl. Elias closed the shutters, but before he could reach the last door, a strange sound caught his attention. It was not the storm's roar nor the hum of his machines. It was softer, like a whimper. He frowned and stepped outside into the storm's edge. Rain mixed with burning plasma fell in bright streaks hissing against the ground. Through the flashes of violet lightning, Elias saw movement near the scrap piles at the edge of his workshop. At first he thought it was an animal, but as he drew closer, his eyes widened. 3 small creatures huddled together beneath a broken sheet of metal. Their fur was soaked, their bodies trembling. They had large eyes glowing faintly in the storm's light. Sharp teeth showed when they whimpered, and their tails lashed nervously. Elias froze. He knew what they were. The Veyrath. Every human colonist had heard stories of them, the predator species that lived beyond the plains. They were strong, fast, and proud hunters. Adults could tear through steel doors with their claws. The colony avoided their hunting grounds, and the Veyrath avoided the colony, but there was no friendship between the two. Only suspicion, and yet here at his feet were 3 Veyrath cubs. Elias hesitated. His first thought was to back away and seal his workshop. These creatures were dangerous, even young. If their parents found them here, it could bring trouble. But as he turned, one of the cubs let out a thin cry, a sound not of threat but of fear. The storm cracked overhead. The cubs pressed closer together, shivering violently. Their small bodies could not withstand the plasma rain for long. If he left them, they would not survive the night. Elias sighed heavily. "Fool idea, Elias," he muttered. "But leaving you out here feels worse." Slowly, carefully, he crouched. The cubs bared their tiny teeth, but they were too weak to resist. With cautious hands, Elias lifted the broken sheet of metal and coaxed them out. They hesitated for a moment, then, perhaps sensing safety, one by one they crawled toward him. Their fur was wet and warm against his arms as he carried them inside. The workshop door slammed shut against the storm, and silence fell. The cubs looked around with wide eyes, sniffing the air. Elias set them down on a pile of cloth near the furnace. At first they tried to scramble away, but the warmth drew them back. Soon they curled together, breathing heavily but no longer shaking. Elias stood over them, scratching his beard. "What am I supposed to do with you?" He had no answer. Instead, he fetched dry cloths and gently wiped the worst of the storm's residue from their fur. The cubs watched him warily but did not resist. One even made a low purring sound when he rubbed its ears. Elias almost laughed. "So you're not all teeth and claws." Hours passed. The storm grew louder outside, rattling the metal walls. Elias returned to his workbench trying to focus, but his eyes kept drifting back to the cubs. They were unlike any machine, unlike any problem he had faced. Each small movement fascinated him. The way they nudged one another, the way their ears twitched at every sound, the way their glowing eyes followed his every step. When he placed a small bowl of water near them, the cubs sniffed cautiously before drinking. He found dried rations in a box and broke them into smaller pieces. The cubs devoured the food eagerly, tails flicking. "You'll eat me out of supplies if I keep this up," Elias said softly, but secretly he felt a warmth in his chest. It had been a long time since anyone or anything had needed him like this. As the night deepened, Elias sat in his chair, the cubs nestled on the cloth pile. The storm showed no sign of ending. Outside, the colony shelters would be filled with families huddling together. Elias had no family here, no one waiting for him when storms came. Yet now, in the corner of his workshop, 3 pairs of glowing eyes kept him company. He thought about the Veyrath. If these cubs belonged to them, their parents must be searching. But how had they ended up alone in such a storm? Were they lost? Abandoned? Or had something worse happened? Elias shook his head. It was not his concern. He had done his duty by giving them shelter. In the morning, when the storm cleared, he would find a way to return them. That was the sensible path. But as the cubs yawned and pressed closer together, Elias felt a tug at his heart. He knew already it would not be so simple. The storm outside raged on, but within the walls of the workshop a fragile peace had formed. For the first time in years, Elias did not feel alone. He sat in silence, listening to the soft breathing of the cubs, unaware that this night would change not only his life, but the bond between humans and Veyrath forever. The storm did not end with the sunrise. For 3 full days, violet clouds and lightning ruled the sky. The colony shelters stayed locked tight, and the plains outside turned into a burning swamp of mud and plasma. For most people in New Dawn, these days were filled with silence and waiting. For Elias, they were different. Inside his workshop, the 3 cubs had transformed the quiet into something alive. Where there had once been only the hum of machines and the clatter of tools, now there were growls, yips, and the patter of small feet. The cubs explored every corner of the place, knocking over boxes, climbing onto shelves, and sniffing at the strange human devices. At first, Elias tried to ignore them. He sat at his workbench repairing a power coil, telling himself that he would return them to their kind once the storm cleared. But every time he looked up, one of the cubs was staring at him with wide, glowing eyes. If he moved to another part of the workshop, they followed. If he sat in silence, they would shuffle closer until their fur brushed against his boots. Persistent little shadows, Elias muttered. One cub in particular was braver than the others. Its fur was darker, with faint streaks of silver along the back. This cub tried to climb onto his chair more than once. When Elias finally lifted it onto his lap, it curled up without hesitation, purring softly as he worked. The other 2 soon followed, clambering onto his legs as if claiming him as their own. Elias shook his head, but he did not push them away. Instead, he found himself talking. "You know nothing about engines, do you?" he said while adjusting a wrench. "But you sit there like you're supervising me. Maybe you think you're teaching me." The cubs made low, rumbling noises in response. Elias chuckled. "Right, you're probably correcting all my mistakes, aren't you?" For the first time in years, Elias laughed out loud. The sound surprised even him. Food became the next challenge. The dried rations he gave them on the first night did not last long. The cubs ate with the hunger of growing creatures, and their sharp little teeth tore through every piece. Elias had to open his emergency supply crates. He tried giving them vegetables and grain biscuits, but they wrinkled their snouts and pushed them away. When he offered strips of preserved meat, however, their eyes lit up. "Predators," Elias sighed. Of course, each feeding became an event. The cubs yipped impatiently, pawed at his boots, and even tried to climb onto the workbench when they smelled food. Elias pretended to be stern, but secretly, he enjoyed their antics. Watching them wrestle over scraps reminded him of young animals back on Earth, wolves or lion cubs from the documentaries he had once seen. At night, they refused to sleep far from him. No matter where he placed the cloth pile, the cubs dragged it closer to his chair. When Elias lay down on his small cot, they climbed onto it and pressed against his side. He tried moving them back, but they returned each time. In the end, he gave up. The warmth of their bodies made the cold storm nights less lonely. By the second day, something unexpected happened. Elias was repairing a damaged circuit board, struggling to fit a small wire into place. His hands were steady, but the angle was difficult. As he muttered under his breath, one of the cubs climbed onto the table. It tilted its head, watching carefully, then reached out with a small claw. Gently, almost playfully, it nudged the wire closer to the correct slot. Elias froze. "Did you just help me?" The cub gave a sharp chirp as if answering. Elias laughed, more amazed than before. "You clever little beast. You're watching and learning." From then on, the cubs followed his every action more closely. When he hammered metal, they pawed at loose nails. When he turned screws, they twisted bits of wire with their claws. Their movements were clumsy, but their intent was clear. They were trying to copy him. Elias began speaking to them as if they were apprentices. "No, not that one. That's dangerous. Yes, this piece goes here. Careful with your claws. To his astonishment, they seemed to understand more than he expected. They tilted their ears when he gave instructions and repeated actions he demonstrated. The workshop, once a place of solitude, now felt like a classroom filled with eager, if mischievous, students. On the third day, when the storm reached its height, the cubs grew restless. They paced near the shutters, growling softly at the flashes of lightning. Elias understood their unease. The storm outside was violent, the kind that shook even strong walls. He sat near them and spoke gently. It's only noise. You're safe here. To prove it, he opened one shutter just a little. The violet glow filled the workshop and thunder cracked overhead. The cubs flinched but pressed against him instead of running. Elias rested a hand on the bravest cub's back, feeling its heart race. Slowly, their growls faded. See? Nothing to fear as long as we stay inside. The cubs looked up at him, eyes bright. In that moment, Elias realized something deeper had formed between them. They no longer saw him as a stranger who had offered shelter. They trusted him, and strangely he trusted them. That night, while the storm howled louder than ever, Elias could not sleep. He sat by the furnace, staring into the fire's glow. The cubs lay curled at his feet, their breath slow and steady. He thought of the Veyrath. If their parents were alive, they must be searching desperately. What would happen when they discovered their young had taken shelter with a human? Would they be angry? Would they see it as an insult? Or would they see him as a thief who had stolen what belonged to them? Elias rubbed his forehead. I should not get attached, he whispered. They are not mine to keep. Yet when he looked at the cubs, peaceful and safe in his workshop, he felt a weight in his chest. They had chosen to trust him, even though everything about their nature said they should not, and he had chosen to care for them, though reason told him to stay away. The storm outside would end soon. And when it did, life would no longer be simple. The next morning, Elias awoke to find the cubs playing with one of his tools. They had dragged a wrench across the floor and were batting it back and forth like a toy. He chuckled and took it from them. All right, enough play. I'll need that. The cubs chirped in protest but followed him back to the bench. They climbed up, settling near his hands as he worked. It was then Elias noticed something else. When he hummed a tune softly to himself, the cubs tilted their heads and made matching sounds. They were not only copying his actions but his voice as well. You're mimics too? Elias said with amazement. What else will you surprise me with? The cubs purred as if proud of themselves. By the end of the third day, the storm began to weaken. The wind softened and the lightning grew less frequent. The colony's alarms announced that people could soon leave the shelters. Elias stood at the window staring at the fading violet clouds. The cubs pressed against his legs, looking out with him. Their eyes reflected the storm's glow, but their bodies leaned toward him, as if uncertain about the world beyond the workshop. Elias sighed. Tomorrow I'll have to take you back. That's the right thing to do. But when he looked down, the cubs stared at him with an intensity that made his words falter. He realized then what he had been avoiding. They did not want to leave, and he was no longer sure he wanted them to. The storm ended with a silence so sharp it felt unnatural. After days of roaring winds and flashing skies, the stillness that followed seemed heavy. The violet clouds broke apart and shafts of pale sunlight reached the plains once more. The colony of New Dawn slowly came back to life. Doors opened and colonists stepped out cautiously, their eyes scanning the damage. Walls had collapsed, machines lay in ruin, and the ground was scarred by plasma burns. But the people were alive, and for them that was enough. Inside his workshop, Elias stood near the window, staring out at the calm world. The three cubs pressed against his legs, watching the light with suspicion, as if they did not trust that the storm was truly gone. This is it, Elias said softly. I have to take you back. He knew what had to be done. These cubs were not his. They belonged to their kind, the Veyrath. Their people would surely be searching. To keep them here would invite danger, not just for him but for the entire colony. Yet as he prepared his small carrier vehicle, the cubs followed closely. When he opened the storage compartment, they climbed in without hesitation, as though ready to go wherever he went. Elias sighed. You're making this harder than it already is. The journey began across the open plains. The land was still steaming from the storm's wrath, and strange lights shimmered in the distance where plasma had burned the soil. The cubs sat quietly in the carrier beside Elias, their glowing eyes watching him. He kept his hands steady on the controls, but inside his heart was heavy. After hours of travel, he reached the borderlands, the wide hunting fields known to belong to the Veyrath. No colonist dared to cross here, for stories told of swift deaths to those who wandered too close. Elias stopped the vehicle and stepped out. The cubs followed, sniffing the air. Their ears twitched, their tails flicked, and Elias realized they sensed something he could not. Before he could speak, the cubs pressed closer to him, growling softly. A shadow moved at the edge of the plains. Then another, and another. From the horizon, figures appeared, tall, broad, and powerful. Their fur shone under the weak sun, and their claws glinted like blades. The Veyrath had come. Elias stood frozen as at least a dozen of them closed in, their movements swift and graceful. At their head was a towering figure larger than the rest, with silver fur that marked authority. His eyes glowed with sharp intensity as he stopped only a few paces from Elias. The leader's voice rumbled like distant thunder. "Human, you carry what belongs to us," the cubs cried out, recognizing their kin. But instead of rushing to their kind, they pressed harder against Elias's legs, refusing to move. Elias looked down at them, stunned. "They were caught in the storm," Elias said firmly. "I gave them shelter." The Veyrath leader narrowed his eyes. "Shelter? From prey?" His tone carried both anger and disbelief. Elias straightened his shoulders. "I did not see prey. I saw children who needed help." The Veyrath hunters muttered among themselves, their sharp teeth flashing as they spoke in their own tongue. The leader raised a claw to silence them, but his eyes never left Elias. "You think yourself kind," the leader said, "but you have stolen their loyalty. Look," he gestured. One of the hunters called out with a low growl, a sound that should have drawn the cubs back. Instead, the cubs snarled in response, pressing closer to Elias. The hunters recoiled in shock. "Impossible," one of them hissed. The leader's expression hardened. "They choose you, human." "But you are not of our kind. You cannot keep what is ours." Elias's jaw tightened. "I will not force them. If they want to go, I won't stop them. But I will not drag them away from me either." The hunters growled, their claws digging into the ground. The tension was sharp, like the edge of a blade. At any moment, violence could erupt. But the cubs stood firm at Elias's side, their small bodies trembling yet defiant. The leader stepped forward, towering over Elias. His shadow fell across the human like a mountain. "You speak boldly for one so fragile," the leader said. "Do you think words are enough to claim respect from the Veyrath?" Elias met his gaze without flinching. "Respect is not claimed. It is earned." The silence that followed was heavy. Then slowly, the leader bared his teeth in something that was not quite a smile. "Then earn it," he growled. The hunters murmured in agreement. One of them spoke. "Let him prove himself, leader. If the cubs see him as worthy, let him show us why." Elias frowned. "Prove myself how?" The leader's eyes gleamed. "Through trial. You will face the wilderness as we do. You will survive not by walls or machines, but by strength, skill, and spirit. If you succeed, we will listen. If you fail, the cubs return to us, and your colony will remain untouched." The cubs growled in protest, but Elias placed a hand gently on their heads. His mind raced. The wilderness was no place for an unarmed human. The Veyrath were testing him, perhaps even hoping he would die. But what choice did he have? To refuse would mean losing the cubs forever, and perhaps worse. He looked up at the leader. "I accept." That night, Elias was left on the edge of the hunting fields. The Veyrath gave him no weapons, no food, and no guidance. Only the cubs remained with him, pressing close as the plains grew dark. The hunters watched from a distance, their glowing eyes sharp in the shadows. Elias sat by a pile of stones, thinking. He was no predator, no fighter, but he had survived storms, repaired machines, and built tools from scraps. If he was to succeed, he would not do it their way. He would do it the human way. He gathered stones and shaped them into sharp edges. He found broken branches scattered by the storm and bound them with wire from his pocket kit. By moonlight, he fashioned simple traps, snares, spikes, and nets. The cubs watched with eager eyes, sometimes pawing at the tools, sometimes imitating his actions. "Not brute strength," Elias murmured, "but clever hands. That's how we survive." By dawn, his traps were set. Small creatures roamed the plains, drawn out by the end of the storm. Elias caught them with patience, not speed. The cubs learned quickly. dragging smaller catches to him proudly. Together, they made a fire from dry grass and sparks of flint, cooking the meat until it was safe to eat. The hunters watched from afar, whispering among themselves. They had expected fear or failure. Instead, they saw resourcefulness. On the third day of trial, the leader himself approached. Elias stood with the cubs at his side, their eyes bright with pride. "You did not hunt with claw," the leader said. "You did not strike with fang. Yet you live," Elias nodded. "Because humans survive not through strength but through thought. We find ways where others see none." The leader's gaze dropped to the cubs. They sat proudly beside Elias, their tails flicking, their eyes fierce. It was clear where their loyalty lay. For a long moment the leader was silent. Then he lifted his head and growled loudly enough for all hunters to hear. "This human is not prey." The hunters gasped, but none argued. The leader turned back to Elias. "The cubs have chosen. And though it shames us to admit it, they see in you what we did not. You will not be their keeper, human, but neither will we tear them from you. They may walk with both worlds now." Elias let out a breath he did not realize he had been holding. The cubs pressed against him, purring with triumph. The confrontation had ended, but Elias knew this was only the beginning. The plains beyond New Dawn stretched endlessly, a wild expanse of jagged rocks, scorched earth, and scattered patches of grass. The storm had passed, leaving the landscape both beautiful and dangerous. Elias and the three cubs moved cautiously across the open ground, every step carefully chosen. Though the confrontation with the Veyrath had ended, the challenge was not over. The trial set by their leader would test Elias in ways he had never imagined. The first obstacle appeared quickly, a steep ridge of broken rock that cut across the plains. To climb it would require balance, careful judgment, and courage. Elias examined the jagged slope. He saw no way to rush across or leap over. Any misstep could result in a fall that would leave him broken and unable to continue. The cubs, however, seemed eager. They darted up the rocks with surprising agility, their small claws gripping every crevice. Elias smiled faintly. "You make it look easy." The cubs waited at the top of the ridge, chirping encouragement. Elias began his climb, hand over hand, foot over foot. The rocks were slippery from residual storm rain, but he adjusted his weight carefully, using stones as support. One loose slab tumbled under his hand, but he held firm. The cubs mewed softly from above, as if guiding him with invisible signals. When he reached the top, his heart pounded. "Not bad," he whispered, glancing down at the climb he had just completed. The cubs twined around his legs, celebrating silently in their own way. Elias knew the trial was not yet complete. This was only the beginning. As they descended the ridge, Elias saw the next challenge, a narrow gorge with a rushing stream of plasma water. The current sparkled dangerously under the sun, and the rocks around it were slick. There was no bridge, no easy crossing. He examined the terrain carefully. Elias realized that brute strength would not help here. He collected fallen branches and twisted wires from the cubs' play area, creating a simple makeshift bridge. He tested each step cautiously, testing the branches for stability. The cubs followed closely, crawling across one by one, their trust in him complete. Halfway across, one branch cracked. Elias's hand shot out instinctively, catching a cub just as it slipped. He held it tightly until it regained balance. The cub yipped and nuzzled his hand in thanks. Elias shook his head. "You're lucky I have steady hands, little one." They crossed safely. For the first time, Elias realized that these trials were not meant to defeat him. They were meant to teach him. Every obstacle tested his patience, his intelligence, and his creativity. The Veyrath had expected him to fail through fear or haste, but humans had a different kind of strength. The sun climbed high in the sky, turning the plains into a furnace. Elias and the cubs approached the remnants of a burned forest, trees blackened and broken by the storm's fury. Inside, they could hear the distant roar of wind still sweeping through some hollows. This was the final part of the trial. From the shadows, small creatures emerged, scavengers native to the plains. Some were fast, darting through broken branches while others tried to hide. Elias realized that his goal was not to kill them, but to capture and protect. He fashioned simple traps using loops of wire and balanced sticks and guided the cubs in setting them. They worked together, silently, instinctively. Elias was amazed at how quickly the cubs learned. When a small creature triggered a trap, they carefully lifted it without harm and placed it safely aside. Each success filled Elias with quiet pride. The cubs mirrored his movements, their trust in him and in themselves growing with every step. As evening approached, Elias and the cubs found themselves at the edge of a cliff overlooking a wide valley. The wind swept across the edge, whipping their hair and fur. The Veyrath hunters appeared on the opposite ridge, watching silently. Elias knew this was the final moment. If he failed here, the cubs would be taken, and the trust he had built would vanish. He looked down at the valley below. A series of rocks jutted out over a chasm, forming a path that could be crossed with careful balance. The cubs pressed against his legs, sensing the tension. Elias spoke softly, though they did not understand his words fully. "We can do this. Step by step together," he began, one foot then another, placing each step carefully. The cubs followed closely, moving as if their lives depended on his guidance, which in truth they did. Halfway across, a rock shifted. Elias adjusted his weight and extended a hand to the nearest cub, steadying it. The others followed without hesitation. When they reached the other side, the cubs jumped and spun, tails flicking with excitement. Elias allowed himself a small smile. "We made it," he said quietly. The Veyrath leader stepped forward. His eyes glowed in the fading light, and his posture was unreadable. Elias felt his heart race. "You have passed," the leader said finally. "Not by claw, not by fang, but by skill, patience, and courage. You have shown what it means to survive in ways we had not considered." Elias nodded. "Humans survive by thinking, by using what we have, and by caring for those who depend on us." The leader's gaze dropped to the cubs, who pressed close to Elias. "They have chosen wisely," he said softly. "Not because you are the strongest, but because you are worthy of their trust." Elias felt relief wash over him. The trials had been grueling, but they had proven something important, not only to the Veyrath but to himself. Humans had strengths beyond raw power. Their ingenuity, patience, and care could overcome challenges that seemed impossible. As night fell, Elias, the cubs, and the watching Veyrath settled down in the valley. The leader spoke to his hunters in a low tone, their words carrying through the dark. Elias did not understand the language, but he could see respect in their postures. The cubs, still glowing faintly from the evening light, circled Elias and pressed against him as they had through every trial. He felt a deep sense of connection. These creatures, once strangers, now trusted him completely, and he trusted them. The leader approached Elias one last time. "Tomorrow the cubs will return to their kind if they choose. But know this, human. You have shown that humans are not weak. Your spirit and your mind are forces that even we must respect." Elias nodded. "I only did what any being would do, to protect those who cannot protect themselves." The Veyrath leader regarded him for a long moment. Then, with a sharp nod, he turned and walked back toward the ridge, his hunters following. The cubs, however, remained with Elias. They circled him, nuzzling his hands and face. He laughed softly. "Seems like you are staying, little ones." The night grew quiet, filled only with the sounds of distant wind and the soft breathing of the cubs. Elias sat down among them, gazing at the stars above the plains. He realized that the trials had done more than test him. They had changed something fundamental. The cubs no longer saw him as a stranger, nor did he see them as mere creatures of a different species. They were companions united by trust, courage, and mutual respect. As he drifted into a rare, peaceful sleep, Elias understood that this was only the beginning. The plains were wide, the Veyrath strong, and the challenges of life in this world never-ending. But for the first time, he felt that humans had a place here, not as prey, not as weaklings, but as beings whose mind and spirit could forge bonds across even the fiercest divides. And somewhere in the back of his mind, he knew the cubs had chosen not only to stay by his side, but to teach their own kind a lesson about the unexpected strength of humans. The dawn broke over the plains like a gentle promise. Light spilled across the horizon, illuminating the jagged ridges, burned forests, and wide valleys that had tested Elias and the cubs over the past days. The air was fresh, still carrying the faint scent of ozone from the storm, and the world felt quiet, almost expectant. Elias sat on a flat rock, the three cubs curled at his feet, their eyes glimmering in the first sunlight. He had passed the trials the Veyrath had set, proving that humans were more than the predators expected. Yet even with victory behind him, he knew the true test was only beginning. Could the bond he had forged with the cubs survive beyond the trials? The plains were alive with movement. Small creatures scuttled across the grass and distant birds called their morning songs. Beyond the ridge, the silhouettes of Veyroth hunters watched from afar, silent and cautious. The leader had left them with instructions to observe. It was clear they were curious to see what would happen next. Elias stood and stretched, glancing at the cubs. "It's time," he said softly. "You can go back to your people if you want. No one will stop you." The cubs lifted their heads. One of them, the dark-furred leader among the three, stepped forward and pressed against his legs. Elias felt the familiar warmth, the trust they placed in him. He crouched, resting his hands on their small heads. "You've seen courage," he whispered. "You've seen care. You've learned what it means to survive together. But now the choice is yours." For a long moment the cubs did not move. They glanced toward the distant ridge where the Veyroth watched, their powerful figures unmoving, silent witnesses. Then, as if in agreement, the cubs looked back at Elias, eyes bright, and let out soft, joyful chirps. Elias understood. They had chosen to remain with him. Word of the trials and Elias's ingenuity had already reached the colony. When he returned with the cubs, the other humans watched with awe. Children peered from behind domes, adults whispered to each other, and even those who had doubted human courage began to see a new possibility. The cubs adapted quickly to life among humans. They followed Elias everywhere, learning not only his ways but the ways of the colony. They watched humans work, discovering tools and machines unlike anything in their wild plains. When a windstorm rattled the colony's walls, they assisted in carrying supplies, warning others with their sharp calls. Elias taught them gently. He showed them how to operate simple machines, how to help others safely, and how to balance their natural instincts with curiosity. In turn, the cubs taught the humans lessons they never expected: how to move silently through the tall grass, how to watch for dangers hidden in plain sight, and how trust could forge bonds stronger than fear. The Veyroth hunters observed all this from a distance. They had expected humans to fail, or at least to be humbled by the predator's strength. Instead, they saw a new kind of strength: intelligence, patience, and compassion working together. The leader, tall and silver-furred, stepped closer one evening to speak to Elias. "You have changed something," the Veyroth said. "Not just for these cubs, but for all of us. We underestimated humans. We believed only in claw and fang. But you have shown that courage, care, and cleverness are forces just as powerful." Elias bowed slightly. "I only did what any being should do to protect those who cannot protect themselves." The Veyroth leader nodded. "And yet, in doing so, you have made our kind reconsider what it means to survive. Perhaps there is more than one path to strength." Days turned into weeks. The cubs grew stronger, learning to navigate both the wild plains and the human colony. They became symbols of the unusual but powerful alliance between species. Colonists no longer feared the hunting grounds near the ridge, for they had seen firsthand that humans and Veyroth could coexist without violence. The cubs formed bonds not only with Elias but with other humans as well. They played with children, guided workers through tricky terrain, and even assisted in repairing machines. Their presence became a reminder that understanding and friendship could flourish even in the harshest conditions. One evening, Elias stood outside, watching the sun dip below the horizon. The cubs frolicked nearby, chasing shadows and darting through the tall grass. He thought back to the storm, to the first moment he had lifted them from the rain. In that moment, everything had changed. A simple act of kindness had grown into a bond that neither species could ignore. The Veyroth leader approached quietly, observing Elias and the cubs. "They have chosen well," he said. "And so have you," Elias smiled. "We chose each other." The leader's eyes gleamed faintly in the fading light. "Then perhaps there is hope. Hope that humans are more than we believed, and hope that our worlds can coexist. You have shown that even the smallest acts, sheltering, teaching, caring, can create the strongest bonds." Months passed. The cubs grew into young Veyroth, agile, clever, and loyal to both their kind and to Elias. They traveled between the colony and the plains, learning the ways of humans and the ways of their species. The colony itself grew more confident, exploring new areas, building new shelters, and daring to expand into the wildlands once feared. Elias became a quiet hero. He never sought recognition, but everyone knew his story. The trials, the storms, and the choices he had made had proven something that the entire colony felt deep in their hearts. Humans were resilient, intelligent, and capable of building bridges even with the most unlikely allies. The cubs, now playful but powerful, stayed close. At night they would curl around Elias, their soft glowing eyes watching him sleep. He often whispered to them stories of Earth, of stars, and of humans who had survived against impossible odds. And in return they taught him about the plains, about instinct, and about courage in its purest form. One day the Veyrath leader returned. He watched Elias and the cubs for a long while, then approached with an unusual gesture. He placed his paw gently on Elias's shoulder. "You have changed the balance of our worlds," he said. "You have shown us that strength is not only in claws but in heart. You have proven that humans are special in ways we cannot deny." Elias nodded, feeling the weight of his journey. "I only did what I could. But the cubs, they made me better too." The leader's eyes softened. "Then let this be the beginning. Let humans and Veyrath learn from each other, grow together, and protect one another. You have shown that even in a world of predators, cooperation and trust can prevail." The cubs chirped, racing across the plains, their glowing eyes lighting the twilight. Elias followed, a quiet smile on his face. The plains no longer seemed threatening, no longer wild and untamed. They were full of possibility, a place where courage, kindness, and cleverness could thrive together. In the months and years that followed, New Dawn became a place of harmony. Humans and Veyrath learned to coexist, exploring the world together, sharing knowledge, and protecting one another from dangers both natural and unforeseen. The cubs, who had once been lost and terrified in a storm, became ambassadors of this new world, a living reminder that bonds formed in trust could change the course of history. Elias, sitting in his workshop, often watched the cubs at play. They were no longer just creatures of another species. They were family, and he understood fully, in the quiet moments of the plains, that the true power of humanity was not in strength alone, but in the heart, the mind, and the willingness to care for others. The world had tested him, tested the cubs, and even tested the Veyrath. And in the end, humans had triumphed, not through force, but through qualities that no predator could measure: ingenuity, courage, and compassion. As the stars rose over New Dawn, Elias looked at the glowing eyes of the cubs beside him and whispered softly, "We did it, together." The cubs responded with gentle chirps, their small bodies pressed against his. The plains were quiet now, filled with possibilities, and the future shone as brightly as the stars above. For the first time in generations, humans were no longer just settlers. They were friends, protectors, and equals in a world that had once seemed beyond their reach. And the cubs, once lost and alone, had found a home where trust, courage, and heart could shape the destiny of worlds.